My Livable City, a magazine for architects, planners, designers, developers, leaders. Learn how great cities around the world make it work. Subscribe at mylivablecity.com. My Livable City, a magazine for architects, planners, designers, developers, leaders. Learn how great cities around the world make it work. Subscribe at mylivablecity.com. My Livable City, a magazine for architects, planners, designers, developers, leaders. Learn how great cities around the world make it work. Subscribe at mylivablecity.com. My Livable City, a magazine for architects, planners, designers, developers, leaders. Learn how great cities around the world make it work. Subscribe at mylivablecity.com. My Livable City, a magazine for architects, planners, designers, developers, leaders. Learn how great cities around the world make it work. Subscribe at mylivablecity.com.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning, boys and girls. Thank you for joining us on this DAIDA Global Awards event, the second year that we are doing this. And I'll start by thanking My Livable City, the information platform which is helping us communicate with you and give all the information on this award because they are partners in this. DAIDA Foundation itself is a small foundation based in the Netherlands, and our mission is to improve the infrastructure and living conditions of the vulnerable groups in cities, particularly in the developing world. To that extent, we have financed different projects in the last 4 years in several countries. And one of the projects which I'm very interested in as a founder of DAIDA Foundation is this particular Global Awards, which we started last year. And the idea was to encourage students to undertake thesis subjects which are really socially relevant and which align with the goals of DAIDA Foundation. So you all have participated in this. And this time the subject, last year the theme of the subject was water and development. This time the theme of the competition is the inclusive city. The interest this time, clearly, last year was the first year, like I told you. So there was a limited number of entries. This year, the entries have more than doubled. And there's more interest, and we are hoping that the year following this, it will increase even further. As you know, there are no costs involved to the universities or to the students in participating in this. And so all the universities from around the world who have a master's program can participate. The jury members who deliberated over the increased number of entries, I'd like to introduce them to you. First, ladies first. So I'll start with Melissa Navarra, a professor of sociology from Philippines. Her background is, and her interest is particularly involvement of community itself, resettlement programs, etc., in informal settlements and in urban areas. So she has about 20 years of work experience, and now she's teaching. Then we have the other jury member, Claudio Ascioli, who's at present based in Nairobi, but originally from Brazil and mostly living in the Netherlands. His CV is very long. He has been, for the last 40 years, worked in more than 30 countries around the world, including many organizations such as United Nations, but also taught at many academic institutions. The third jury member, I'm myself. I'm an architect and planner by training, have studied in India, England, and the Netherlands. And I'll leave it at that just now. You will get to know me better later. We have, especially yesterday and today, as advisor to the jury, we are very happy to have Jose Chong, Mr. Jose Chong. He is of the UN Habitat and is responsible for the Global Public Space Program of United Nations. He's originally from Peru, presently based in Nairobi, and was trained also in Germany, a planner, architect planner by profession. The task of coming down from a large number of participants to a select group of 12, because we decided after some deliberations in the jury to come down to 12, that was a difficult one. And it led to a lot of discussion. And finally, we came to this list of 12, which will now be displayed to you by Akash. Akash, please display that list of 12 shortlisted candidates. Okay. And what is interesting to see is not only the gender balance. In fact, the ladies have beaten the gents in this one. I think there are 7 shortlisted women and 5 shortlisted men. But the most interesting part, I think, is the fact that the students are from so many different faculties, from environmental science to planning to architecture, landscape architecture, habitat studies, urbanism, all sorts of master's programs around the world are participating. Yesterday, we had the 12 shortlisted candidates. We put them in alphabetical order, and the first 6 on those made their presentations yesterday, and today the second 6 will be presenting. After this, the jury will take a couple of weeks to deliberate among themselves to come to a final conclusion, and the main award ceremony will be on the 16th of February. There are just a couple of things regarding the protocol I want to tell you as 6 presenters. Yesterday too, we gave each participant 7 minutes first, and then we gave them a warning. Akash comes with a warning. So you have totally 8 minutes to present. After 7 minutes, you are given a warning that only 8 minutes is left. At 8 minutes, we'll just cut off your presentation. We want to be fair to all of you. So we don't want to give one person a longer period than the other. So please make sure that you finish your presentation in 8 minutes. Following that, there's a Q&A session. And in total, those 8 minutes plus the Q&A session gives us about 13 to 14 minutes per participant. Some friction time, it's 15 minutes per participant. And we will be fairly strict with this time. So I'm going to request the jury members today to pose their questions. Do not take too much of that time. So when you ask a question, please ask the question. Quickly come down to the point so that the students have more time to present their case. We can start with the first participant now. And that is, I think, Gauri Satam. Is that right? Akash, you can present the...
Hi, good day, everyone. This is Gauri Satam. My thesis is Restoring Charkop's Intertidal Wetlands, Reinstating the Socio-Cultural Landscape of its Kolivada. Kolivada means the fishing villages. So, as you guys are aware of Mumbai, Mumbai has been a coastal city which was aboriginal to about 40 fishing villages at one point. Today have been reduced to about 15 active fishing villages in the city. So the city has been has been a landscape of negotiations over time. One such case is that of Charkop Kolivada, the fishing village, which was once a small island of about 75 acres in the Manori Creek of Mumbai. Their profession was basically fishing with some farmlands. In 1940s, it was the Britishers who brought an industrial estate very close to this island, landfilling their farmlands and making some breakwaters. In 1985, it was the MHADA, which is the Maharashtra Housing Development Authority, which came up with an affordable housing project here by landfilling a lot of these intertidal wetlands to create affordable housing for the city. Today, Charkop is somewhat a scenario like this, where those intertidal wetlands which were lost are now just about around the Kolivada with another amount of coastal wetlands which are protected by the government. But these intertidal wetlands which are on one side of the Kolivada are yet alienated and neglected, just like the Charkop Kolivada in itself. So my thesis intent has been primarily in two parameters in terms of place and the people. In terms of the ecological layer, it's about establishing the importance of these intertidal wetlands, assessing the threats, revive the wetland ecology, and regain the lost urban resilience. In terms of the socio-cultural layer, it's about studying the rich intangible heritage of the Charkop Kolivada, assess the needs and their threats, try and reinstate a sense of identity within this Kolivada, and basically create a landscape which is accessible, productive, participative, and importantly inclusive towards a landscape of negotiations. So quickly starting with the place, understanding the importance of Charkop's intertidal wetlands as the much needed sponges of the urban development. So these sponges, these wetlands acted as prime absorptive layers for the 2005 floods of Mumbai. So as you see in this picture, these sponges have over time degraded and have been fragmented. Coming back to the intertidal wetlands, which I have been studying from these two Google Earth images, you can see very clearly how these wetlands have been reduced due to degradation, fragmentation, and landfilling. These wetlands have now turned to just concretized channels. They have been facing ecological degradation, disconnect with creek, encroachments, and a social neglect. However, these intertidal wetlands play a very important role for the ecosystem services that they provide, as well as the hydrological value that they have. In terms of the sea level rising due to climate change, these wetlands again play a very important role. Coming to the layer of the people and the practices, these wetlands were once home to a lot of fishes, which were, defined by the intertidal movement which happened, and which were the livelihoods of these people at one point of time. Where farming and having an extensive native landscape of forest was a part of their ecology. They had a rich intangible cultural heritage within this native landscape. However, today the landscape of the Kolibada is somewhat on these lines, where the fabric of closely knit 3,000 fisher folks with narrow lanes, no vehicular access, threatened by encroachments along fringes, alienated with surroundings. However, there are hints of productive landscape within the community yet. They have a very beautiful, rich cultural heritage, where I have tried to map the annual festivity mapping. You can see the vibrance, the undocumented yet dying cultural heritage that is there in this village, even today. So giving an example of one of the fishing villages in the community, you can see the space transformation of this one spot, how the space transforms. You can see the multiplicity, the adaptability to temporal needs that happens. However, there are these existing redundant open spaces within the community. The current open spaces within a kilometer, 1 kilometer radius is just 3%. Also, one very important parameter that is affecting this community is the coastal road, which is a major threat, which is triangulating this village. So the Kolibada has basically an identity crisis and alienation and a disconnect with the land and its livelihood. So these are the two layers which are the threats. And coming to my proposal in terms of the design intent, it's about, again, in two layers of, first, in terms of place, restoring the intertidal wetlands, creating an urban resilience and preserving the native biodiversity. In terms of the people, it's restoring the indigenous identity of the people, creating more productive, participative landscapes, and finally bringing people together through equitable and inclusive planning. So in terms of the proposal, I have scaled it at 3 different scales of intervention. The first scale is of the intertidal wetlands. The second is of reviving these existing community spaces. And the third one is reimagining these social nodes towards creating it like an art district. So through my proposal, from 3%, I have increased the accessible greens to 13%. So starting with my scale number 1, the scale number 1 is about redefining the notion of a neighborhood park. Why are urban parks, seen as generic, contextually irrelevant, high on water? Why can't the Indian parks be seen as more functional, ecologically sensitive, as sponges of resilience towards our city? So from the past landscape to the present to a future, which could be about urban resilience, about water urbanism, towards a landscape of collecting, holding, infiltrating, swelling, shrinking, and draining the water, towards a landscape which addresses the high tide, the low tide, the peak monsoon, and which is still accessible to the people. Creating zonings which are much more utilitarian in terms of, even understanding the salinity of the soil and giving plants accordingly, towards creating a landscape which is much more productive as well as accessible and inclusive to all the communities, not just the Kolibada. So having layers of accessible, productive mangrove forests, which incorporate tidal variations, incorporating seasonality, having more inclusive, equitable and utilitarian landscapes in terms of, firstly, identifying the stakeholders, which is the Koli people, and creating local food cycles through vegetable farms, through oyster mud crab farming, through islands for bird watching, restoring native food forests, making these wetlands accessible, having these different pause points within the landscape, adaptive to temporal needs, and finally, having blurring the boundaries. Coming to my scale number 2, the scale number 2 was about, creating from the existing to the proposed, creating a more equitable, gender neutral, inclusive and participative, community space for these people. Yeah, thank you. So in terms of making their community spaces kind of getting that adaptability, celebrativeness, and while also making them equitable. In terms of my scale number 3, it was about reimagining the social nodes. A space which is like this can be transformed into a living museum of indigeneity, native material palette, native plants, reviving the cultural heritage while creating the Kolivard as an art district. So combining the 3 scales together to a landscape somewhat like this, joining the dots. Finally, once again, revisiting my intent to my design implementation. And then again, phasing my planning in terms of the 3 scales and how they would be scaled over the next 7 years and how would they be overlapped. So, and these are the different SDGs that I have addressed through my thesis. So, thank you. Urban resilience through landscape of negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Gauri. Excellent presentation, good in time, understandable, good slides. Jury members, do you have a question? Melissa or Claudio?
I think Jose would kick off a good intervention there, because I think it touched very much your core responsibilities at the moment.
Okay, Jose.
Yes, I can kick off. No, thanks a lot. It was a very good presentation, Gauri, and very nice graphics. And I saw that it's like you went from the different scales, going to the details of public space design. I was wondering, I think you increase a lot of the amount of public space, and actually you are touching about the quality of public space. That is something that is fundamental when we are talking about improving the quality of life of the people and residents. And I think you were mentioning, and I think as a concept of your proposal is the landscape of negotiations. I was wondering, from the negotiations that you had, between place and people, what are the more important and what are the fundamental in order, for your project, to start or to project to work? Because maybe, in these negotiations, there are some that are more important. For instance, for us, it's quite important the management of the space. This is a very important issue, but I was wondering more, if you go more on deep on this landscape of negotiations. Over.
Yeah, thank you. So the landscape of negotiations comes at different layers. In terms of the place also, the negotiations is between the land and the water, how the water comes in and recedes. It is between the place and the people. So the people, original inhabitants, So it's about the negotiation they have with the place, the landscape, again with the tidal patterns. And then the negotiations is between the people who are the aboriginal inhabitants to the urban dwellers who have come here through the city planning. So, the negotiations between these two communities as well, how do you get them together on one platform? And finally, the negotiations are also about how do you take this project ahead in terms of, getting it through the government or making it more, understandable to the community, trying to tell them how this can be negotiated and reimagined and revived. So the negotiations happen at different levels, and I'm sure the negotiations would be even further. So okay. I hope I have answered you.
Yes. Claudio, you had a question. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I go straight to the point. You spoke about land reclamation or land filling, which I assume the land becomes public, and therefore you propose a series of interventions on the public domain, assuming that there will be, as you just said, this strong participation of the people. So could you elaborate just a little bit more when you spoke about joining the dots, because it's multiple scale in multiple interventions? How do you see that feasibility? Is it a wishful thinking, or do you believe in how this can be really realized?
It is very much possible, because joining the dots is about the different scales that to be knit together into this whole fabric. It's about not just for the benefit of the Kolivada, but also the urban dwellers who are a part of this landscape today. So this landscape development, which will be a very important urban project in itself. A city like Mumbai has so less amount of accessible greens. Also, although there are greens, a lot of mangrove patches along the entire coast of Bombay, but they are not accessible. So how do you make them accessible and also productive, and also bring these different communities together and kind of co-benefit each other? So, and that's what it means by joining the dots. And these communities over, if you see in Mumbai, it's the coastline has not been taken forward in terms of connections. If you try to have a blue-green infrastructure along the coast of Mumbai, kind of, this could become a pilot project of an art district, and there could be many more like these, which could be further connected. And these coastal communities themselves could be the, stakeholders or carrying forward the heritage which they have, and it could become a beautiful fabric of the city, which is there but not known to the urban dwellers. So I think that scale of starting from a very small node and trying to create that little bit of art and within the community, trying to empower them, trying to make them understand that your identity still exists, and let's promote it, let's celebrate it, and let's bring the urban dwellers with us. And then tying these knots together is what I meant by joining the dots.
Okay. I think we have, your time is up, so we will just leave it at that. You have been able to answer some of the questions. Thank you so much, Gauri.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You'll hear from us. So can we go to the next presenter? I think that's Ramona Sheff.
Hello, my name is Ramona Schäfer. First of all, I want to thank you for the nomination of my project, The Work is Madinat, which deals with housing for migrant workers in Oman. My interest in this topic originated from my research and teaching experience in Muscat, Oman, and today I want to give you an insight in my investigations. So in Oman, isolated and separated from the global population, hundreds of thousands of low-skilled migrant workers from mainly South Asia live in labor camps across the country. Indispensable for the national economic growth and the construction businesses, the workers make up an important part of the Omani population, yet they are often housed in inappropriate conditions. And now, with the coronavirus, the situation has even worsened. The municipality of Muscat sees the need for more workers' accommodations, yet the strategy of creating temporary container camps remains the same. And in order to propose a counterexample for the rising labor cities, this project examines an alternative that could benefit both the migrant and local population. After researching and collecting data of about 91 labor camps in the Muscat capital area, I was able to make some observations. So these camps vary in size from sizes of camps for 20 workers to up to 5,000 workers. And so did their accommodations. Yet what they all had in common were their walls. And despite the temporary construction, they were quite the opposite of temporary in many of those cases.
Ramona, there has been a lot of noise. It's been very difficult for me to hear. I think your mic, you hitting your mic, or it's coming a lot of noise. So.
I plan to go back to Oman to get a closer look into the labor camps, but because of the COVID-19 restrictions, it was impossible for me to fly there. So I started interviewing workers that live in those labor camps on Facebook. I also managed to get some information, pictures and videos on Google Maps, on social media channels like YouTube, Instagram, as I said, Facebook, and even TikTok. With the material, I was able to identify recurring patterns. And then I started documenting these in 4 ethnographic studies, as you can see here, namely domestic practices, social spaces, religious rituals, and mobility. And here you can see that I put these patterns into a spatial context. And here you can see things that I could identify in several camps, such as overcrowding in the rooms, overheating, which is a huge problem in a desert country. The lack of storage space, which is why you could usually see the beds stacked up on bricks to create a bit more of that. Also, the lack of designated space for laundry, so you could find it all over the rooms, or even hung between air conditionings. There are also problems with the centralized light, so it's hard for the workers to have an individual routine at night. There were also some aspects worth preserving, which I also wanted to document, which is something small, but just a little threshold in front of the units for the workers to leave their shoes. But also several social spaces that are preferably in the shade for them to have events, demonstrations, to play sports, etc. But also to practice their religious rituals and have festivities, or even small fields of flowers. In terms of mobility, the workers often live on site, and if they want to get around, they would need to cross the highway by foot or hitchhike, which is, I think we can all agree, not okay. But in other camps, you could also find shuttle buses or workers using bikes. Okay, so my concept is to build a resilient neighborhood for the workers, which are currently located in the urban fringe, which will, with further growth of the city, be used by mid and higher income expats and locals, while the workers will keep moving with the growth of the city inside the urban fringe. Like this, the project will be interesting for investors because the return will in the end come through mid and higher user groups. So the site is located at the intersection, I will show you now, of this large highway and the wadi, which is used by everyone for relocation. On the periphery of the Madinat, Madinat, by the way, is Arabic for city, as an explanation. You can find a public souk, a temple, and a mosque that is public for everyone, to also address the surrounding neighborhoods and connect the Madinat with its surrounding. The wadi is a channel that occasionally streams, but because of the higher location of the Madinat, it is safe from flooding. The earth is full of clay or in and around the wadi, so it can be excavated, mixed, rammed, transported, and assembled on site, which is the concept of the construction of the neighborhood. And also the earth is very fertile, so you could implement urban agriculture, which is for local food production, but also to enhance a cooler microclimate. The Madinat itself consists of 6 neighborhoods, which each contain several clusters with semi-private courtyards and a variety of public spaces, which contain sports facilities, resting areas, and neighborhood mosques and temples. Within one house, the workers find several social spaces that include terraces and kitchens, but one unit is meant for one worker alone. To have a wardrobe, a bed, space to write or to pray, and a well-ventilated unit at all times. 2 units create a small space for the workers to leave their shoes and working clothes. 4 units share a bathroom, and 8 of those units come together in one floor. The open floor plan, as well as the section, are designed with the hot climate in mind and to enhance natural ventilation at all times. The houses are designed to be added like puzzle pieces to create a variety of public spaces and street. They can be formed into a courtyard that is again designed to be cross-ventilated and cooled down by small channels that originate from the wadi I mentioned earlier. So with the future growth of the city, the Madinat will bit by bit, here you can see how this implements, now all those patterns I found in the research with the current design. Since I had some technical difficulties, I feel like I'm gonna miss 1 minute, so I want to skip forward a little bit. With the future growth of the city, you can see that the dwellings and the social spaces have to adapt to different user groups. So what has once served for a homogeneous male society now serves for also women and children and elderly people, while the infrastructure also adapts. So this mixed compound can actually be adapted to one of the story patterns. This is made to have space for everyone in the city and create resilient neighborhoods for everyone. Thank you.
Ramona, thank you for your presentation. We as jury have been able to read your full report, so please understand that, okay? However, it's a pity indeed that you did not finish in time. I'm going to ask you one, before I give the jury members a chance to ask more questions. I'm going to ask you one question. Excellent, beautiful graphics, by the way, and very nice idea. One thing which I fail to understand, which you must explain to us, is that at this moment, all the workers are being put up in different separate camps. There is a reason for that, okay? How will you manage to get the population mix which you are suggesting? What will convince their employers or the government or whoever takes the initiative to do this? Who will be doing this? I mean,
I completely understand this question, which is also something that was something that went through my whole investigation, because why would anyone be interested to make this? Because right now the situation is that the workers are living in their camps, and no one needs to worry about it. But the point is that these neighborhoods would actually be built by the workers and create a more sustainable backbone for the Omani urban development. So there should, in the best case, there would be developers and also the municipality interested in doing that. Because what's happening right now in Oman is a massive urban sprawl, a very unsustainable development of solitary villas that take in a lot of energy, but also massive segregation. So you cannot actually walk anywhere. You need a car for everything. So this would actually benefit the local population a lot, because it is a very there's a human scale to it, a very sustainable construction method, which also saves them money for cooling it down, etc., etc. And for the employers, I don't think much would change, because the workers would keep on moving with the industrial areas and construction sites where they work. However, they would all live together instead of like living in company-related camps, but the workers would live together, and this step-by-step transformation of a social mix, I think would benefit everyone. I hope this answers your question.
Okay. Any other jury members? Claudia, you have raised your hand.
Thank you very much. I worked in Saudi Arabia and Dubai and the Emirates, sorry, and this is a hot issue because these are guest workers with very limited rights. There are human rights issues that you actually illustrated there in your research, and also the difficulties because they're largely segregated, spatially and socially, economically. Now, the challenge there, as I see in your incremental development proposal, is the mix. You assume that there will be cross subsidies because you will attract higher income groups, and you will have that mix income and perhaps mix use in your design approach, as I understood, because there will be a lot of amenities and let's say land use that allows commerce and basic needs for people just to walk out and go to the supermarket and things like that. So how feasible do you think, and did you think about let's say a possible strategy to respond to your ethnographic analysis, which were quite thorough? I must commend on that.
Yeah, so indeed, the thing is with the mix is that it's not going to happen at some point that there's going to be low-skilled migrant workers living next to high-income Omanis, because this is going to be, as I said, a smooth transition of them, basically also keep moving outside. And also because, as you already mentioned, in the ethnographic studies, I was able to make observations, and I don't want to force integrate anyone with anyone. That's not the goal of this project. But as you mentioned, there are some interfaces like the public souk. Already now, the souks so the markets in Oman, they are run by migrant workers, hardly anymore by Omanis, or maybe they are the boss, but the people who work there, they are migrant workers, and it's a place for everyone to meet in a way, also higher income Omanis. And this is where I see at this point where it's a workers' Madinat, where the social mix is being created. And later on, in terms of it being feasible, it will be a transition in many ways in terms of infrastructure and public spaces to cater for different income groups. And as you could also see, there were several neighborhoods in this whole Madinat. And as I said, I'm not planning to force integrate or like create a social mix that is not wanted. But this is going to be a smooth transition, and the investors could basically expect a return after 10 to 15 years.
Okay, Ramona, thank you so much. Unfortunately, the time is finished, so we have to go to the next candidate. Thank you for presenting.
Thank you.
And we look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thank you.
The third candidate today is also from TU Delft, Mr. Zhuo Ming Xia, if I am speaking his name correctly. Can we just let him in, please?
Good afternoon, jury. Welcome to my presentation, An Architecture of Enablement, a participatory housing process for Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. I believe this looks very familiar to many of us, as it represents the problem that many of us are trying to overcome. My project takes place in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, where authorities have chosen a short-term solution to its problems of rapid urbanization, a system that favors efficiency over sensitivity, standardization over flexibility, and homogeneous illusion over a heterogeneous reality. These drawings depict the already implemented grand housing scheme, a repetitive cookie-cutter solution of identical condominiums surrounded by a sea of undefined and neglected outdoor space. For Addis Ababa and so many other cities in the global south, is this the only option? In my research, I tried to find an alternative system of housing production, one that focuses on process rather than product, with user participation at its core. And today I would like to use my design to convey 3 principles that I think are important in designing a participatory housing process. First, levels of association. I think in the subconscious of all dwellers, there exists different familiarities with different scales of space. Take a room, a house, a street, a neighborhood. Tapping into this can enhance the dweller's sense of ownership over their spaces and encourage more cooperation between neighbors. So here I have designed a building for multiple close-knit families, and perhaps they are even relatives of each other. And here they don't mind sharing much of the terrace space. And this is called the pavilion typology. The next typology, the row house, can accommodate more families, but this time each one has a greater sense of privacy. In the courtyard typology, they can house even more families, but in smaller, more affordable dwelling units, and that look onto a shared open space. Stacking these units on top of each other, and you arrive at another typology, the tower, and one that has, in contemporary times, become a sort of aspirational mode of living. Bring all these typologies together, and you make the dwelling cluster, the next scale up from the building. And the cluster allows different income groups to coexist and to cross-pollinate. Finally, string many of these clusters together with a central linear public space, and you get the supercluster. This is my prototype of a neighborhood that responds to different levels of association. And due to the flexibility of the system, no 2 buildings, and hence no 2 clusters, are exactly alike. Incremental growth. Incremental growth also goes hand in hand with user participation, as well as they're not all going to make their decisions all together at the same time. Participation also does not occur spontaneously, as you need a clear structure in order to define what dwellers can have control over. And so therefore, the first piece of architecture that is built is the support, which is made of mass-produced concrete components. Then begins the infill process, where local architects work with families and local contractors to start to enclose space and start to create homes. Over many months, the infill will become more and more mature, and over many years, some parts may even be demolished, changed, and to suit the ever-evolving needs of the family that occupies it. Incremental growth also occurs on an urban level. The neighborhood is completed in phases. Dwelling clusters organically mold over retained existing buildings, while it rehouses people it displaces. The existing street pattern remains, and important nodes and gathering spaces are maintained. The development of the central spine starts after the entire section of the city is completed. This operates as another level of association. Each sector has its own identity, and due to the common spaces inside it. And lastly, I want to talk about heterogeneity, which in many ways is the end goal of my design project. It is to make housing that is sensitive to our many differences and ultimately housing that serves us better. Here I reiterate, heterogeneity cannot be expected to suddenly exist out of nothing. It requires an initial design that defines the rules of the game. And side note, this idea of supporting infill actually originates from a group of Dutch architects known as the SAR. On an urban scale, heterogeneity comes from not completely wiping out the existing settlements, but embracing its irrationalities, its quirks, and its character. This is accompanied by an urban grain that is complex but clearly defined. And here you see the front of the buildings. There is an activated pedestrianized zone that may give rise to a market, but similarly, a series of private allotments, food stalls, shops, or a large tree where friends can meet, and spaces where children can play. While all kinds of customization, additions, extensions happen to the dwellings on either side, it even provides space for existing dwellings to extend into as a result of densification over time. By contrast, the vehicular corridor services the dwellings and connects it with the wider city. Here, the facade facing the road is more regimented. Kitchens, bathrooms expel their waste into the communal collection pipe. You can see the road loops at the end, creating another moment of intensity and giving rise to more shops and public functions. And so hopefully through this explorative hypothetical neighborhood, I have demonstrated that there is an alternative to the disastrous mass housing we see all around the world. It is a bottom-up approach that considers the voice of individuals, families, and communities, but at the same time, it is also a top-down strategy where building components can be made at a large scale and combat citywide issues of urbanization. It results in a product that is rich, but a process that is repeatable. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Shobik. Excellent presentation. Before I give word to the jury, I want to say something. When I came into to the Netherlands in 75, 76, I had a chance to work on the first SAR project, which was Professor Habraken's structure and infill project, which was built later on. It was of architect Frans van der Werf, which was built in Molenvliet, Papendrecht. So you probably know that. Very, very nice to see that almost 50 years later, this is still actual and you're using it. I have one question. Are the densities which you're achieving in your illustrations, are they similar to the ones which were shown earlier in those regimented blocks? That's all. That's my only question.
Yes. So definitely the densities do compare.
Okay.
And that is because that, as you can see, the FSI of the condominium schemes are very high because there are tower blocks surrounded by a lot of open space. Yes. Whereas open space in my scheme is a lot less, it's a lot more intense at the ground level. The GSIs are a lot higher. So,
no, excellent. Excellent. Yeah, I understand. So thank you so much. Use your time for something else. Melissa, I'm convinced. Okay, Melissa, do you have a question? Last time you
Yes, I have a question. Thank you, Zo, for this presentation and for coming up with different typologies. No, I'm just wondering about the participation element in your presentation. And then in your last slide, you said that it's very top-down. So I'm assuming that this thesis didn't really dwell on the participation of the target sector. But then how do you imagine these designs to drive participation among the target sector. And how rich is community organizing or social movement in Addis Ababa? Because that's also, a crucial factor in implementing participatory housing in a context.
Yeah. I think all through this process of my thesis, I was trying to just bring these two elements, this top down, but also this bottom up, as kind of trying to bring them together. In terms of participation of people of Ethiopia, of Addis Ababa, they have, so like with any sort of community around the world, they have existing structures of participation of how they organize themselves, and these can be seen in the sort of the funeral associations known as the DAIDA. And my scheme, through its different scales of intervention, I think really tries to take advantage of this sort of existing organizations. Maybe you say maybe a group of clusters can have their own sort of public space, have their own meeting space, and to facilitate and to enhance this sort of group initiation. And that is sort of my main driver for what I think would drive participation of the user. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuo. So you need to engage with community housing associations or people's organizations, trying to embark on housing, socialized housing.
Yes. So I'm tapping into these existing organizations and kind of enhancing them. Yeah.
Can I jump in if Jose doesn't have a question very quickly on the condominium principle of the solution adopted by the government? I actually led the first study on the condominium housing there, and we did a publication both in local language and in English done by Habitat. One thing struck me about what you spoke on dwellers control. One of the issues that emerged there is that it's a ready-made solution. The land is publicly owned, so upper hand of the government to produce quantity because an incredible housing need. So how do you see this dwellers control in such a scale that you propose, which I must commend your option for housing diversity? It's really, let's say, responding to what we see in the world, that they need for that. So not about the diversity, but more on how do you see the users control at that scale you propose?
Right. So although I'm proposing a scheme at this scale, it's sort of DNA, if you like, it's building blocks, is this sort of this individual house unit. And I think this sort of dweller control is at its highest. This is what its highest level of participation at this level. So you see this very open building approach, this structure, which is built not through participation, but that enables participation in a sense. And so the dwellers, well, in this case, individual families, I'm proposing works with a local architect to basically talk about their needs and to define their space within this existing structure. So this could be to define the living room slightly differently to the bedroom, maybe having a larger bedroom or a larger living room. This sort of, and also this negotiation with neighbors about the spaces they share. There's another level of participation at that.
Just quickly on the land use, do you suggest mixed land use?
Mixed land use, how do you mean?
Well, that you don't only have housing, but you have housing, commercial, and other uses.
Yes, of course. So income generation to integrate that within the housing cluster and to have this sort of these different open spaces perform different roles. So this as a more public land use, and this inside of the cluster as this more private, more intimate sort of backyard, shared garden situation. Yeah.
Okay, now because of time constraints, lots of questions on this, but interesting scheme. Thank you so much, Zuo Meng. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
let's have the next participant now, Divyanshi Srivastava from CEPT in India.
Hello, good morning, honorable jury panel. My name is Divyanshi Srivastava, and I'm going to take you through my thesis on the management of night shelters for the urban homeless. It will be divided into 5 segments, the first segment being the introduction. We generally observe that a lot of homeless people use the underbridged spaces and tents to spend their nights, especially during extreme weathers, which gives rise to the demand of one of the most important services provided by the urban local government to the urban poor, which is the night shelters for the urban homeless. And these night shelters are the first formal point of contact for the urban homeless with the government. And the quality of this service as the first impression plays a crucial role in a person's acceptance or rejection of this help. According to different media reports, it reflects that the status of the night shelters and the issues faced by the homeless, especially related to the trust and security, makes them to stay on streets rather than using the shelters, which formed the basis of my problem statement in the research, to which the research question was arising as to how can the shelters for the homeless be effective in meeting the needs of the urban homeless, which can be fulfilled by answering three objectives. First, how are the models of different cities working right now regarding the night shelters? Second, why do the homeless still prefer to stay on the streets rather than in the night shelters? Third, what measures can be taken in the night shelters in the present situation of the spread of COVID-19? To which the research methodology included literature study, case studies, analysis, inferences, and recommendations. Homelessness is one of the worst forms of urban poverty and social vulnerability, where the people belong neither to the permanent housing or the slums. Other than rapid urbanization, which leads to migration, the other 2 main causes of homelessness are poverty and failure in housing supply system. The government should be ready to tackle this ever-increasing phenomena in the cities of the world. Talking about the Indian government, it came up with the Shelters for Urban Homeless scheme, SUH scheme, under National Urban Livelihoods Mission, NULM, under the Ministry of Home and Urban Affairs, which led to the interpretation that the study of adequacy, perception, and condition assessment should be brought in focus, for which 2 case cities, the capital city of Delhi, a union territory, and Lucknow, a city and city in the state of Uttar Pradesh, were analyzed under 3 parameters. First, of adequacy, second, effectiveness, and facilities management. By studying the models adapted by these both cities, it was observed that according to the norms of SUH scheme, which states 1 night shelter for every 1 lakh population of the city to cater to 100 urban homeless, we can see that the required required number of night shelters is more than the ones which are present in both the cities. According to the perception study of the users, non-users, and officials of Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, which is known as DUSIB, and Lucknow Municipal Corporation, it was inferred that there is ambiguity in defining the homeless, who are the homeless, and inadequate number of night shelters, undefined duration of stay, and unwillingness and unawareness amongst the homeless. Moving to the facilities management summary, which included the parameters such as proximity to night of the night shelters, availability of lockers and food and drinking water, etc. It can be inferred that drinking water and food are one of the major issues which are faced by the inmates of the night shelters, along with the social audits for the monitoring of the night shelter services, which directs us towards the recommendations. First, adequacy can be countered by having different and distinct criteria for union territories and cities as they differ in their terms of actual and floating population. Thus, a single formula will not suffice for the needs of the night shelters for the union territories, which in the case of Delhi have a population of 30 million and in case of Lucknow have a population of 3.7 million. So there's a huge difference and a single formula to apply for both. Second, ambiguity in defining the homeless who can access the service can be countered by defining the focus categories or the vulnerable categories so that a different set of night shelters can be made for them. Then, defining the duration of stay, the undefined duration of stay for which counseling sessions should be proposed so that the users develop a sense of responsibility rather than a sense of ownership in these night shelters. The signages and posters in local languages and involvement of general public and government is proposed to increase the awareness among the urban homeless. Interlinkage of the night shelters with the religious institutions and general public must be done to arrange for the meals. Also, the social audits, being the most transparent term of evaluation, must be done at least once a year so that the night shelters can improve in providing these facilities to the urban homeless. Also, survey of the homeless must be done to get the number of people to be served, which can be done by the municipal corporation or the DUSIB with the help of third-party survey, which thus helps in coming up the required number of night shelters in the cities. Now, moving on to my third objective, which was to address what measures the night shelters should take during the spread of COVID-19. It was done with the help of an Ishikawa diagram, which helped me to infer that there is a sense of unawareness among the homeless people, presence of crunch space in the night shelters, lack of guidelines for the admission process of the homeless, lack of information board and maintenance of apt distances between the beds, which would make these shelters as the points of high risk during the spread of COVID-19. Recommendations for which will be on ground level for the inmates as well as the homeless on the streets. It mainly focuses on detailed process of admission and facilities along with the rescue operation for the willing homeless and geotagging for the unwilling set of homeless. Alternative sites and awareness programs could also be encouraging to the homeless to access the night shelters in this time. Along with this, a standard operating procedure was proposed for the night shelters during the spread of COVID-19, which includes focus on supplies like gloves, disinfectant, and use of napkins, along with hand hygiene, fund sanitizers, wash basins, along with the awareness in means of posters, hand hygiene information in the local languages. Also, the staff needs to be vigilant in maintaining the alternate bed layouts and arrangement of the meals. It can be in the form of grab and go so that a lot of cluster is not developed inside the night shelters. And it can cater to all the unwilling homeless people who still decide to spend their time on the streets rather than in the night shelters. So this is the detailed SOP that is displayed here, which talks about the scope and the responsibility, accountability, and the procedure that should take place in these night shelters. Hence, my recommendations are both on a policy level, which can be the long-term measures that could be taken, along with the ground level measures. Again, summarizing these measures as immediate measures addressing to the inmates of the night shelters, SOP for the night shelters, and actions for the homeless still living on the streets, and the long-term measures to put a cap on the duration of stay in the night shelters so that they have a sense of responsibility rather than a sense of ownership in the night shelters, conduction of social audit, linkage with religious institutions for meals, effective use of third-party surveys. Thank you.
Thank you, Devanshi. Thank you for your presentation. A totally different topic than we've had, other topics we have had today. Jury members, is there anybody who has a question? Melissa, would you like to ask something?
Yes, Sham. Devanshi, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I really love the presentation because this sector, the street dwellers, in the Philippines, we call them street dwellers. They are the starkly under-researched. No? So I love this research. But then one thing that I'm wondering is, Didn't you have any findings on adjustments needed in night shelters, no? So that adjustments in the structure itself, no? So that it will become more responsive to the needs of women and children.
Yes, so while in my facilities management summary, I managed to look at this aspect also. But this was not the whole sole aspect that I looked into. But yes, it was a part of my facilities management part, in where I included that how the vulnerable groups, including the women, the children, and the specially able, could be catered in the night shelters.
Does it answer? Because this was I have a question which is similar to this, and that is that so I'm just adding on to this because to give you a little more chance to answer this. You suggested when you started your study, you said that if people who are homeless, they much rather stay on the street instead of going into the shelters. So they have a sense of insecurity going in there, I presume.
Right.
And that must have something to do with the way those shelters are, or is it the management of the shelters which makes it insecure, or is it the physical environment? What makes them feel insecure? Why are they not? So what do you do to that to make sure that they use the facility?
Yes, so one reason is that a lot of people who come to the night shelters, because of there is no cap on the duration of the stay, they stay for a long period of time. And also because of the vulnerable groups have not been given a different set of night shelters, they have to adjust with the people who are still living in the night shelters since a long time. So they develop a sense of ownership there. They don't even let people to come in and just stay there for a longer period. So there is a sense of competition which they face. Also, there is a sense of insecurity in the terms of, as I showed the news reports where the mother says that I paint my girl's face black so that nobody recognizes her at night, because I don't want to go to the night shelter because there are drunk people and I don't want to expose her to that. So I rather live on the streets. So yes, there is a sense of insecurity, and this can be done by putting a cap on the duration of stay. Also, with having a different set of night shelters, especially if it is meant for women and children and especially able. So I think this will bridge the gap why they are not accessing the night shelters, which are still here, but meant for everybody inclusively.
Okay. Yeah. Any questions? Jose, yes. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, only a very quick one. I think the study was very interesting on the relation between homeless and shelter. I was wondering because the issue of homeless is broader than that, no? So I was wondering if you in your research analyze other possibilities to bring other possibilities for homeless, for example, to get access to social services, to get access to jobs, or alternative solutions. For instance, we had projects in South Africa where actually we invite the homeless people to participatory workshops, because it's they know the space, and at the end it's when they mingle with the community, they were employed to bring security to the space, no? So I was wondering if you had also that characteristics on your research.
Yes, for this, many of the night shelters here are having these kind of sessions with the inmates so that they have their capacity building and they can, move further in their life, not just stay back in the night shelters. So yes, they still have these kind of facilities, and many of them I've interacted with them. Many of them have moved out of this kind of life and chosen a better life, and because of these sessions which go on in the night shelters.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Divyanshi. Thank you so much, and for answering the questions and making your presentation. So Akash, we can go to the next presenter, and I think that is Stefan Veenendaal from the University of Cape Town.
Land tenure reform in South Africa has failed, leaving the land rights of millions of rural South Africans insecure and therefore invisible to formal planning practice. My name is Stefan van Veenendaal, and this afternoon I invite you to explore with me my master's research into this very question. Why does land tenure security matter to planning? In this brief presentation, I'll begin by explaining the background to this problem, which stems from a history of settler colonialism. To answer why land tenure security matters to planning, it is important to ask what we mean by land and what we mean by land tenure security. Two key conceptualizations of land are identified to answer the first question. The first is that land is viewed as private property according to a Western paradigm of ownership, and the second is an African indigenous concept of land. To answer the second question of what does land tenure security mean in a South African context, critical discourse analysis was used to analyze South Africa's post-apartheid legislation in order to determine which of the three discourses of land tenure security, namely that of the economic, legal, and adaptive schools of thought, are most manifest in South Africa's land and planning legislation. I will also briefly discuss some of my key findings without getting too much into the specifics of the policy recommendations. South Africa's communal areas consist of the former homeland areas and are largely rural and peri-urban in nature, and often lacking in basic services. Formal planning is, as I have said, virtually non-existent here. The reason for this is multifaceted, but centers around two pre-existing and disparate sets of planning laws for the former white urban areas and the former black urban areas and rural homelands, and the imposition of a foreign legal form of tenure over the indigenous understandings of land. Compounding this is the lack of legislative clarity currently around who is ultimately responsible for these areas, whether it should be the state or traditional leaders. An attempt was made in 2013 to rationalize the disparate planning systems inherited post-apartheid, but this framework legislation, the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, struggles to adapt to rural communal settings. In these areas, land is not owned according to the common law understanding of land as property, where land is parceled into unique things and exclusive to an individual owner. Instead, while individual entitlements allow for a degree of de facto individual rights to exist, these are not exclusive, and access to land is premised more on group membership and function within that group. There is therefore a mismatch between the traditional land tenure systems and planning as it is framed within the Western notion of private property. Seeing this mismatch, this research explores what land tenure security means in South Africa in order to better inform how planning can interact with traditional land tenure systems. In addition to this primary research question, this research also asked how land is conceptualized in South Africa. What values and meanings are attached to the term land tenure security, and how are these reproduced in the land and planning policies? What form of land tenure is viewed as secure, and how can this be achieved? And lastly, how has the meaning of land tenure security shifted in South Africa since 1994? As I mentioned, two conceptualizations of land are important in South Africa. The first is the common law understanding arising from the imposed Western legal ideas of private property, in contrast to the indigenous African understanding of land, which was hijacked and systematically dismantled under colonization. Within both of these conceptualizations of land and tenure, planning in some form is also present, leading to the view that planning can be seen as a component of any tenure system if a system's view of tenure is adopted. Land use planning is, however, entangled within the private property view. In order to get at the potential meanings of land tenure security in South Africa's land and planning policies, this study used critical discourse analysis, or CDA, to explore how this phrase is used and reproduced in these policies. Discourse theory views all language as socially constructed, where meanings attached to text are assigned in constant flux within a social context, and where discourses, in turn, shape society. CDA was chosen as it allows the inherent meanings and assumptions underlying communicative events, in this case the legislation and policy, to be challenged. CDA is also inclusive of a theoretical framework, namely that of Norman Fairclough's three-dimensional model. This model sees the text as nested within the discursive practice, which describes the way the text is produced and consumed, which is in turn nested within the social practice or context within which the text is produced. Before assessing South Africa's policies, I performed an extensive search of the literature on land tenure security, which revealed three potential discourses from the work of Zimbizi, Bennett, and Zevenbergen. These are, firstly, the economic discourse, where land has a capital value in an economic system where land can be traded. The second is a legal view, which stems from the economic view and which focuses on securing tenure in a legal way, but focuses also on the justice and rights of those of that tenure. Third one is the adaptive view of tenure security, which sees land tenure as more socially organized and stems from this author's call for more inclusive understandings of tenure, which can include customary land rights. In my research, I covered a lot of ground. While I made specific policy recommendations which are specific to South Africa, I will not go into too much detail on these, and I will instead paint with broad brushstrokes an overview of my findings and their implications for planning practice. What this study has made clear is that planning, as it is framed in South Africa, is still heavily entangled with the Western private property paradigm, reproduced through the economic discourse of land tenure security, which dominates in the land and planning law. This is particularly true of land use planning, where a degree of neutrality is expected in the land use planning process, and where issues of justice and the distribution of ownership of land are not questioned. Yet planning as this social process of spatial ordering is an element of even traditional tenure systems, and is within these systems neither solely neutral nor technocratic, but is instead embedded within the social organization of the community and is heavily informed by a member's need and purpose for accessing land and the suitability of land to that purpose. One question which is also invariably asked of planning is, who is the person in charge of land? In order to answer this question on communal land, we need to adapt how we think of this notion of control and broaden it to allow for a range of tenure rights to legitimize this control. Also rising from the literature review, and particularly in respect of the motivations for pursuing security of tenure, many of these motivations for land tenure security are coincidental with the aims of planning, such as the effective management of the environment, improved land productivity and efficiency, to name but a few. All in all, in order for planning to have any effect on communal land, we need to adapt our systems to be cognizant of traditional forms of tenure. In my thesis, I made several policy recommendations based on the analysis of the legislation and policies, as well as the findings I have discussed here. One of these is that policy making should be brought down to the municipal level, where it can be localized and better adapt to these communal settings. In the end, the law must reflect the values of society, and where it does not, ours is to challenge it. And it is my hope that this thesis has done exactly that. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my work with you, for shortlisting me to be part of these very exciting awards. I'm excited to hear what questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan van Veenendaal, for taking us into a system, into a thesis which is much more abstract than some of the earlier ones which we had. And I'm looking at the jury members to see if somebody has a specific question. Claudia, you are very much interested in land ownership, tenure, security, those issues. So maybe you will have an interesting question for Stefan.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan, for bringing us through your research questions and your findings. Quite challenging, particularly in South Africa, where after 1990, the whole transformation in the country, where land was critical in the whole central solution, how the country would move forward. So you mentioned your mismatch between the Western Roman-based law and legal framework that recognize private individual property with the African indigenous notion of land ownership and tenure security. My question to you is that when looking to planning, and which means the use of land for collective interests, particularly when you have urban agglomerations, how do you see planning decisions and urban plans implementation within these context where tribal or customary land ownership coexists with Roman-based law, private property regimes?
Cool, thank you for that question. I think in practice, what it will rely on is the involvement of traditional leaders and all layers, essentially, of traditional communities. What has happened is that traditional leaders are kind of left out of the loop in terms of formal state planning practices. So we end up with a situation where municipalities are forced to essentially just tolerate traditional leaders. And it becomes very cumbersome for people who live on traditional land to make development applications as private developers, because they all need to go to the traditional authorities who then reject the municipalities, and the municipalities don't know how to work with the traditional authorities. So a total mindset shift is required to allow traditional authorities and give them a greater scope and recognition of their roles in the management of community life and in the management of community allocations of land, so that they're not silent partners, so that they're able to direct it and bring community input into that process. So yes, the nexus relies particularly on involving traditional leaders within the municipal planning processes.
And these traditional, can I just come in for a moment? Claudio, does that answer your first question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was going to do some follow-up, but it's better that I
yes,
also
please follow.
floor for others.
No, please follow.
Yeah, okay. Because this is a very critical issue in Africa, particularly where things get stuck, and then nothing happens in terms of development because you have an insecure land holding, and then investors, banks, development banks, UN agencies, they don't enter into that because it's not documented, it's conflictual. And do you believe that just bringing in the chiefs and the leaders, traditional leaders, will help solving the problem?
Not completely, unfortunately, and in many instances, it has the potential to do the exact opposite. I can think of particularly, and I referenced it in my thesis, the case of a place called Polobeni in the Eastern Cape, where a large international mining company applied for mining rights over dune sands on the coast, and the traditional leaders in the area were essentially given free rein to approve and approach this mining conglomerate and essentially do as they like, and steamrolled their local community. So there have to be checks and balances between that. And we cannot simply assume that a traditional leader will represent the best interests of a community. There has got to be a recognition that traditional leaders in the way that these communities function have to be held accountable and responsible for their actions. And I think that is already endemic within many of these communities, but tends to be politicized.
Thank you. Right on spot.
Melissa, you have something?
Yes, I have a question, Stefan, because I believe that what you're covering in this thesis are the indigenous communities. Aren't they protected by the universal right of indigenous communities to right to their ancestral domain, right to their land, right? Because indigenous communities are intimately related with their land, and land is actually their human right.
That's a very good question. Thank you so much, Melissa. So I haven't done too much digging into the universal rights of indigenous communities. It gets a little bit fuzzy in terms of who gets recognized as an indigenous community in South Africa. In fact, there are many arguments around that. So, for instance, the Black Bantu populations, who make up the majority of the population, tend to be sidelined in that debate because the question then falls on perhaps with the Khoi and the San, the originally indigenous groups. And there are many, there's quite an ugly political fight around exactly how that's defined. But in South Africa, we do at least have the benefit of the Constitution, which provides for the universal-ish protection of land rights for everyone in South Africa, well, property rights more specifically. But there is also the informal protection the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act, which was meant to be an interim temporary measure, but it essentially grants secure tenure to all informal and precarious occupiers across the board. So we're talking about farm dwellers, we're talking about informal settlements, we're talking about customary settlements, but it's very piecemeal and very haphazard and hasn't really been extended into something more meaty, even though the courts have tested its ability to protect people's rights.
Okay, we'll have to stop now, Stefan. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
Jury members, thank you for your questions. We'll have now the last of the 12 shortlisted candidates following this, and that is Sarah Zakaria from Ain Shams University in Cairo, Egypt.
Hello, my name is Sarah Zakaria, and the topic of my research is the environment and children-independent mobility, the case of El-Zabalin and informal settlement in Cairo. The introduction starts with a quick overview on children between urbanization and informality, where according to the UNDP 2030 agenda, 90% of the urban expansion in the coming decades is expected to be hosted in the developing world, where 20% of this urban population is expected to be living in slums. Hence, slums are becoming a more significant feature of urban life. Therefore, to address this challenge, Goal 11 of the SDG was dedicated to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, with two of its goals focused on affording or providing safe, affordable, inclusive, and sustainable transportation and public spaces, with a special attention to the vulnerable groups, women, children, persons with disabilities, and older persons. Why is the focus on children, which is the focus of my research too? This is because they constitute up to 26% of the world population, and this children population, 86% of which lives in developing world, where 52% of which lives in poverty and not in inclusive, safe, resilient, and accessible cities, leading to the research problem statement, which is the increasing gap between children's needs in this rapidly urbanizing world and the urban planning practices, leading to a decline in the children-environment relationship and impacting children development. So the aim of my research is to advocate for more accessible, safer, and interactive environments for children, enhancing their environmental representations as well as socio-emotional development. So the focus of my research will be on children as a theme, and then environment, and how the children-environment relationship impacts children development. And the focus will be on the children-environment transactions using environment behavior studies, applying the concept of children-independent mobility, and trying to understand the correlates manifested in the environment as external forces, whether social and physical, and in children demographics as internal forces that impact CIM. So what does CIM mean? This term was coined by Mayer Hillman in 1990, and it means the freedom of children to travel around in their neighborhood or city without adult supervision. So the objective of my research is to investigate the environmental correlates of CIM, their extent of impact, their direction of impact, and how they interrelate together. My empirical research starts with the area of study, which is Cairo, where 70% of its population lives in informal settlements, And the focus will be on Manshayat Nasser, which is one of Cairo's largest and most densely populated informal settlements. Manshayat Nasser is divided into 11 neighborhoods, and the focus will be on Zabbalin neighborhood, which is the garbage collectors area. The procedures of my research starts in phase 1 with quantitative methods approach that starts with drawing activities by children in order to understand their environmental perceptions through neighborhood mapping, followed by questionnaires to children and their parents to understand or to measure the CIM of children in relation to children demographics, utilizing Mayor Hillman's 6 licenses holding, which are going to school alone, crossing the streets, taking public transport, and going out for leisure, cycling on the roads, and going out after the dark independently. Followed by the second phase, which is a qualitative approach, and it will be semi-structured interviews with children enjoying high CIM and low CIM, their parents, and a group of teachers in order to understand CIM licenses condition, CIM spatial range, and children and parent environmental perception in relation to CIM. So the findings from the questionnaires illustrated CIM correlation with gender, where according to the following 2 diagrams, you can see that boys were noticed to enjoy higher CIM to girls across all ages, reflecting a direct gender correlation. And following the CIM correlation with age, as you see from this diagram, you can see that the maximum score for a high CIM was reached in the 6th grade, and for the medium CIM in the 4th, and for the low CIM in the 2nd grade. However, the highest percentage of CIM achieved in the 6th grade was still surpassed by a low CIM, which means that a big number of children at this age loses their freedom. So in this study, opposite to all existing studies, CIM does not necessarily increase with age, but it's more interrelated with gender. From the parents' interviews, the environmental perception in relation to CIM was outlined and translated into a group of physical and social environmental correlates. The first physical one, which is traffic danger, parents expressed that tuk-tuk drivers, which is the main public transportation in the area, and the reckless driving and high flow of pickups and lack of pedestrian infrastructure was a major threat impacting CIM. Followed by social apprehension, where stranger danger, when parents were asked about it, they didn't see it as a problem since due to the area's social and family-oriented social structure, where one of the parents said that the idea of harassment is not possible and it doesn't even cross my mind. Followed by children inappropriate behavior, which was a huge important threat shared by the parents. And then culture and traditions implicated in gender roles and community judgment was also a major concern implicated by most parents. Followed street physical dangers, which is manifested in darkness, stray dogs, dirt and leakage, and all the physical dangers that children face frequently in their daily trips. And it was a normal scene that got normalized by most children, so parents didn't see it as a threat. Getting lost was mostly reported by mothers and over younger girls, mainly in the 2nd grade. And community surveillance as an unexpected outcome was seen as a positive aspect that totally correlated with CIM. From the children's interviews, environmental perception was illustrated, and the mitigation techniques that children resorted to in order to maintain their spatial autonomy in their neighborhood was outlined, where some children mentioned that they have a superpower, which is running, that they used to overcome traffic danger. Another one mentioned also running to overcome stranger danger. Another one mentioned company of sibling or friends to overcome their fear of being alone. And another one said that they are used to the area and they know it very well, that they do not fear getting lost, and there are no strangers in the area, and we know everybody, so there is no stranger danger. So in conclusion, this socioeconomical model of CIM demonstrates the environmental and demographic correlates that impact CIM. To start with the demographic ones, the gender was a major correlation, which also interrelates with age and impacts CIM, followed by the birth order, where children having older siblings were noticed to enjoy higher CIMs. Work from home lifestyle of parents also granted more CIM and impacted it, where it provided more visual supervision over the children. And being young or getting lost was also impactful, but not that much. And it was more gender and age interrelated. Coming to the physical correlates, the distance was directly related to CIM, followed by living on a secondary street, which granted children with, yes, thank you, which granted children with more licenses, like cycling on the streets or going out with friends, followed by traffic danger, which was a major threat shared by children and parents alike, and street physical danger was not that much of an impact. Coming to the social correlates, other children's misbehavior was a major threat as expressed by children and parents alike, followed by culture and traditions, which impacted gender roles, and it was interrelated mostly by age and gender. And it also impacted community judgment. And then following was the community surveillance and the stranger danger that didn't have much of an impact. My set of recommendations is divided into two parts. The first one is the CIM discourse, which is to learn from the Zebbaline peculiarities and potentials and apply it to the rest of the city, conduct more context-specific, comparative-specific research, and expand the sampling categories, understand culture. And okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for your presentation. You did it, tried to do it very quickly. And I think just about didn't manage the end, but I think just about, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm looking if any jury member has a specific question. Jose, please. And
thanks a lot, Sarah, for the presentation. And it's like we have been working a lot actually for safe public space for children. And it's we have a lot of methodologies, and it's working now with WHO and UNICEF, because it's we know that the importance of safe environments in order to have a proper development for children. I was going to go more to your recommendations, because I think you did a very extensive analysis of the situation, and it's maybe since you didn't have the time enough to explain your recommendations, I was wondering what are your main conclusions of how to improve the condition for children related to physical environment, but also on the way that they move in the neighborhood. And maybe and also if you found some differences between children living in informal neighborhoods or formal areas of the cities, because also they will have certain differences on that. So maybe if you can go on this, and also if you have what are the highlights of the difference between the perceptions of safety between caretakers and the children itself. So I think that will be interesting, also looking forward on the recommendations. Over to you, Sarah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so as I said, to improve the built environment itself, it's as shown in the socio-ecological model, is totally knitted together with the social aspects. So I cannot really separate, because, for example, the urban structure of the neighborhood, which is very compact, which is the idea of the informal area, it totally also impacted the idea of the social structure, like the idea of community surveillance. Okay. So let me try to say it clearer. Okay, so first in the recommendations, there was one that is totally related to the physical part, which is trying to identify the relevance and the priority of the environmental problems being addressed, so that we do not address problems that are not totally important in a certain area, because each area, depending whether it's formal and informal, has its own challenges. So in this case, for example, the physical challenges in my case was mostly traffic danger, which was also the case in other studies, for example. So if I'm going to be trying to do any physical intervention, I have to start addressing the most relevant problem that most parents and children alike refer to, which is, for example, the traffic danger. So I have to see what they refer to: the infrastructure, the lack of pedestrian pavements, the minor, which has also another social aspect, because it's not only manifested in the infrastructure, but also in the drivers' attitudes and behaviors, which is the minors and the reckless driving. And so it's all related, like the set of physical and the social, I cannot really separate, they all interrelate. So if I'm addressing one physical problem, I also have to see its social dimension and how it interrelates with others. This is coming to this part. And coming to the part, sorry, the other part was, the second point was what?
No, maybe difference between formal and informal land, and also
yeah, okay.
and then children.
Yeah, okay. So caretakers, it was really funny that caretakers totally affected the fears or the perceptions, how they perceive the environment they live in, totally impacted or influenced the perception of their children. However, as I mentioned, even if they had the same perception, which is the fear of traffic or the fear of other children's misbehaviors, which is bullying and stuff like that, they used mitigation techniques. They had more confidence in themselves. So it was also impacting the anxiety levels in the parents and how children tried to mitigate these perceptions that even if they shared it with their parents, they resorted to certain medication techniques that overcame their fears and granted them with more spatial autonomy. And also coming to the formality versus informality, my case was more focused on informal areas. However, this comes in my recommendation because I know that the urban structure will be totally different in formal areas with totally different social institutions and structures. So this is why I'm giving in my recommendation that we need to conduct more context-specific research and make it comparative so that we understand the difference taking place here and here. Because this is very sensitive, that even in informal settlements, comparing two informal settlements to each other, they can totally have different outcomes or socioecological models. So this is why having context-specific and comparative studies helps us to understand the variables between each setting you're studying.
Okay,
Yeah.
so, I think Claudia has a question. Sarah, just a couple of minutes to answer Claudia's questions.
Yeah, very, very quickly. Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. You chose a very specific environment to research, which are the Zabaleen communities that exist in Greater Cairo region, Esbet Nacho, Manshit Nasser, and others. Now, in the beginning, when I saw your thesis, I was expecting you to connect to how is children to live in a garbage collection community that use recycle and use development cooperation to generate an enormous amount of resources and are responsible for 1/3 of the collection of garbage in the city. So, but you chose the informal development or informal settlement and children mobility within that. Now, having said that, and looking at the propositions you make, how do you see the future of children by applying some of your conclusions and recommendations in this particular settlement? Very briefly, how do you see the transformation? How can this actually make a difference for children?
Okay, so it's more, the thesis more promotes children as active agents of change. So if I manage to understand the problems that the children face daily in their trips they take to school or out with their friends, I can also understand or ask them for their ideas of change. How do they overcome these challenges and how they can give us more ideas for change, for a positive change, and for urban to be considered by future urban interventions. So what I can see is more empowered and enabled children to share their voices and ideas of change towards this coming interventions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah.
Okay.
And with you, we have come now to the end of today's program. And I'm going to make a couple of announcements which are relevant to all of you. The first of them is that My Livable City continues to be the platform through which we will be communicating with you like we have been doing till now. So keep on looking on the website there if there are announcements regarding any follow-up. There are going to be two things which will come up there anyway. And one is that we are going to have the final award ceremony on the 16th of February, also in an online setting. The second is that in the questionnaire which we had posed to you, in which we probably ourselves were not very clear, we had asked you to say something about a follow-up project. The reason being that DAIDA has actually kept a certain amount of money, which is 5,000 euros, to do something on site, not necessarily another research again, but we would like to see something on site itself if it's possible. Some of the candidates filled up that bit of the application form, others did not. So it is not clear to us. So we will ask you once again to fill this, but we will communicate with you in the coming week so that you have a time in the coming 2 weeks to try to answer that, so that the jury can take that into consideration. Another point which I want to mention is that some of your studies, obviously we will be giving first, second, and third prize, which are amounts of 6,000, 5,000, and 4,000 euros to the first 3 winners. But the other thing which we would like to offer, which we did last year too, was in an agreement with My Livable City, that we would like to offer the possibility of publishing some of your studies in the magazine My Livable City, the next issue, which will come out in July. So we will probably approach you to give us abstracts of 2 pages or something like this. We'll mentor you on that, how to best to do that, so that your publication can come in that, even if you do not probably get the winning first, second, or third slot, because we'll see which theses are probably very suitable for that. With that, I would like to thank you all, and I would like to request you to leave the platform now, so that